The best Canadian podcasts, the latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. The winners of the Canadian Podcast Awards were announced. The People's Choice Award went to Frequency's Parkdale Hunt. You'll find a full list linked from our show notes and our newsletter at podnews.net. Australian podcast ad spend is up by 33% year on year, according to ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia and Magellan AI. Meanwhile, SCA and Veritonic measured brand sonic logos in Australia, including those in podcasts. The company ranked highest across almost all indicators, including recall, correct identification of the brand and industry, and emotional attributes, including trust, familiarity, and authenticity, was Bunnings Warehouse, with a Veritonic audio score of 86. Overcast is to close its web player next year. Marco Arment, the developer, said he's never had the time or the modern web development skills to make it a great way to use Overcast, and adds that the experience is, quotes, terrible. Faris Aranki has decided to be on as many podcasts as he can, and he's posted what he learnt in a blog post that we link to from our show notes and our newsletter. Among the learnings, preparation is rare, most podcast hosts are blokes, and about 15% of the podcasts he's been on never get released. And do you love RSS feeds? Feedle calls itself a search engine for blogs and podcasts. In People News, Breaker co-founder Leah Culver, who's recently been working on Twitter Spaces, is still at Twitter, though she's offering to help people hiring. Kimberly Lee, the product designer of Twitter Spaces, is, however, out. Or perhaps she might not be. Twitter is apparently asking people it laid off last week to please come back. Anyway, I'm on Mastodon. If you want to follow me, I'm at James Cridland at podcastindex.social. It's a Monday, so time for some tech stuff. Will Pocket Casts beat Apple Podcasts in adding a correct user agent for all podcast requests? Now it's open source. John Spurlock submitted a pull request adding the correct user agent code, which has been accepted and will be in Pocket Casts later this month. Disappointingly, Apple Podcasts itself has yet to implement the company's own code, introduced for iOS 16. Value for Value streaming gives a lot of data to podcasters, and Conshacks is a new Value for Value dashboard that interfaces with your Albi account, showing it. You'll be able to see, for example, the number of supporters throughout an episode of your podcast, as well as boost messages. It's very cool. Can a $798 AQ Vox audiophile network switch make an amazing difference to your audio? Linus Tech Tips have taken their claims and looked at them closely. John Spurlock has been evaluating user agent lists for OP3 and has tried both OPORG and Buzzsprout lists. He promises exciting things in the next week or so. We link to a nice tool today that generates a podcast GUID for your podcast. It should be in your RSS feed ideally. A GUID never changes, by the way, even if your RSS feed does. How was Libsyn's hosting done when launched 18 years ago in 2004? We'll link to, from one of their founders, some of their notes. Underneath an architecture diagram, the phrase research, colo and dedicated hosting. I'll bet. Umbrel 0.5.3 is out, fixing a few bugs, and thank you to Dave Jones, Adam Curry, Real Coach Andy, Mitch, and the Optimal Living Daily Podcast for your boosts last week. If you get value from Podnews, hit that boost button. And if you don't have one, podnews.net/new podcast apps. And in podcast news, Astrology Coach claims a galaxy first, using dynamic ad insertion technology to tell your future using tarot cards. The show is an astrology and tarot show using podcast tech to its fullest from ARN's iHeart Podcast Network Australia and Dead Set Studios. Corinna and the King is a new investigative narrative podcast from Project Brazen, looking at the shock abdication of King Juan Carlos in 2014, which opens a window into a dangerous world of greed, corruption, violence, vast pools of hidden wealth, international espionage, conspiracy, hedonism, and elephant hunting, all tracing back to one of the most secretive royalties in the world. And More Than a Feeling has returned for a new season, and it'll start with The Dread Project, a week-long social experiment delivered via podcast designed to help listeners get a little more acclimatized to one of our most uncomfortable forms of fear. And that's the latest from our daily newsletter. To read all the stories and subscribe, we're at podnews.net.